Hello, I'm Deb Schaffer. I'm Principal Consultant with Stone Ridge Software on the SMB team. Stone Ridge Software is based out of Barnesville, Minnesota. And I am super excited to be presenting for DynamicsCon and appreciate getting voted in to do this presentation. So today we're going to be covering some new and uncommonly used features in Dynamics GP. And we're going to start out with a list of what those features are that we're going to cover. And then I'm going to go through a demo of each of these as well. So we're going to talk through additional user-defined fields in GL transaction entry, transaction level post through the GL, comprehensive document attachment, which includes bank reconciliation, automating of the full financial reconcile under utilities in the general ledger, exporting and importing stock counts using Excel, one payment per vendor, or one payment per invoice, or one payment per vendor, and being able to set that at the vendor level, long descriptions for payables transaction entry, copy paste to purchasing transactions from Excel, new smart lists for deposits associated with unposted sales transactions, and start and end dates for pay codes. For the uncommonly used features in Dynamics GP, we're going to look at integration of payables and purchasing to fixed assets, using account categories with Management Reporter, looking at and using the Reconcile to GL routines, and the all-in-one views that are available. So with that, we are going to jump into Dynamics GP, and we are going to start out with the additional user-defined fields in the general ledger. And I'm going to rearrange my screen here just a tish. All right, so within the general ledger, when we start in financial and go into setup, the general ledger setup now contains the two new user-defined fields at the bottom. So these are identified as user-defined transactions labels. And as an example, we could identify these as projects and tasks, and they can be assigned at the GL transaction entry and then reported on as well. So I've identified my two user-defined fields, and now I can go into financial, general, under transactions, and in our transaction entry window now, we can see project and task identified as these two new user-defined fields. So you can populate those when you're entering in transactions, and then you'll be able to report on those also. The next thing that we're going to look at is the transaction level post through the GL. So this is new functionality that will allow us at the transaction level from the subledgers to post those all the way through when we post transactions. So I'm going to go into administration and posting, and this is going to open up the posting setup window. And if we go into purchasing and an origin of payables transaction entry, we can see that we now have the ability to mark this post through general ledger files at the transaction level post. And so what that means is when you enter a payables transaction and post that transaction, you will be able to post that directly through the GL. And I'm going to just save my changes there. The next area that we're going to look at is the comprehensive document attachment, and that does include bank reconciliation as well. So when we go into purchasing again, and I'm going to go in and take a look at our vendor card. When we bring up a vendor, we have the ability to create attachments for these vendors and do that comprehensive attach similar to what we've been doing in purchase orders and other sales transactions and sales documents. The next area that we're going to look at is the comprehensive document attachment, and that does include bank reconciliation. So within the financial area, when we look at our bank transactions, bank accounts, and checkbooks, we're now able to identify additional document attachments. So that full document attachment that's been available in purchasing and sales. And so that document attachment is going to allow us, when we put transactions into the system, to do that full document attachment that we've done before. So I'm going to create a bank transaction and enter in our dollar amount here. Yeah, except for I don't want to do that to my cash account. The next area that we're going to look at is the automation of the full financial reconcile. So this is found under utilities in the GL. Typically, you use this reconcile when you're doing things like running check links, or if you're doing a combine of GL accounts. It's always recommended that you run this full reconcile for accounts or based on your year's transactions if you're making changes significantly within the general ledger. So typically, or what's happened in the past, is when you come in to do this reconcile and you click on year, you have to do this process from oldest to newest. So you would go with the oldest year that you have in GP, and then work your way forward reconciling for each one of those. Now we have the ability to just click on all, and GP will reconcile all of the year's information that are set up in GP, oldest to newest, so there's nothing that you need to do as far as doing it individually, so it saves a lot of time when you're doing that reconcile. The next area that we're going to take a look at is importing and exporting stock counts through inventory, but using Excel to do this, which is a great feature in here. I'm really excited about this. There hasn't been a good way in the past to do the imports other than doing them manually or potentially through another integration process. So to use the import and export, I'm just going to bring up the demo stock count. And this is going to give me my particular items that I have on the stock count, and I'm just doing 2 here for the sake of time. Once you have all your items selected, then you're going to click on the Export Import button, and we're going to choose Export. This is going to export the stock count to a file folder wherever you're saving this. So I'm going to click on Save. It's going to tell me that the file has been exported, so I can click on OK, and I can continue on with my count. So I'm going to close this. I would go out and do my count on my new file, and so I'm going to open that up here, and I will bring that over. All right, and here is the file that's created. So we've got our locations and our items, the item description, if there's a serial or lot required, what our unit of measure is, and then doing our quantity on hand or count status. So what we're doing here is just entering in the quantity that we're counting for this item, and then we're going to save this file, and you can save it with the same name, and I'm going to click on close, and then I'm going to go into my stock count entry, and I'm going to bring up my stock count, and then now I can go in and do the export import, and I want to import my file, and I'll bring that in. It's going to tell me my import process is complete, and I've got my counts here. They come in also as verified, and so at this point then you can process this and post the transactions for the stock count. So it makes it a lot easier to bring in stock counts when you've got a large inventory that you need to do those stock counts for on a potentially regular basis, more than just once a year. The next item that we're going to take a look at is one payment per invoice or one payment per vendor. So the setting for this is actually at the vendor level now. So in previous versions, this was available only when you were doing the select check batch. now at the vendor level. So I'm going to go into cards and vendors and bring up a vendor. And if I go into options, here I can now define if I want one payment per either vendor or invoice. So this setting will override the setting that you do on your check batch. So the vendor setting wins on that. The next thing that we want to look at also in payables is the ability to do a long description. So this is a long description that has up to 200 characters. The first thing that you have to do in order to use that is go into payables management setup. So purchasing, setup, and payables. And you want to check on this last option on the right side here, the enable long descriptions for payables transaction entry. Once you have that checked, then when you go into payables transaction entry, you'll notice that there is now a long description field. And this long description will carry through the transactions and stay with that. So if you've entered a long description here, the full 200 characters, this will appear in the inquiry windows as well. So you'll be able to see that and you don't lose that history once the transaction is posted. The next thing that we're going to look at is the copy-paste purchasing transactions from Excel. And so in the GL, we've had this for quite a while that we could do a copy-paste and bring transactions into the general ledger. Now we have this ability within payables as well. So the layout that we need for that transaction, and I am going to just get this opened up. So the next topic that we're going to look at is the copy-paste functionality within purchases. So for a long time, we've been able to use copy-paste in the general ledger. Now we're able to do that in payables transactions as well. So the first thing that you need to do is you need to set up your file that you're going to be importing into payables transactions. And the file that you need to import is going to have the following columns on it. And it does need to be set up exactly like this. So you have to have your vendor, your purchase, trade discount, freight, miscellaneous, document number, PO number, and cash. Now you don't have to populate all of those fields. So if you don't have a trade discount or freight or miscellaneous charges, you don't have to have numbers in there. You do, however, have to still have all of the columns in there. So in order to import this, you're going to highlight just the data in the file. So you don't need to highlight the header information. You're just going to copy the data for the file itself. And once we have that copied, then we're going to go into payables transaction entry. And we're going to enter in just our first vendor ID. And then we're going to tab down to the purchases field and then paste our transaction in. And I'm not on something correct here. So let me bring my file back. And we should be good there. There we go. So that's going to paste in, and that is going to show us, get this out of the way here. It's also going to open up our cash because I entered a cash amount here. So you do want to have which checkbook, you're still going to enter in that information, but you can default that in as well. So a great new feature within GP. If you haven't moved to 2018 yet, this is a great incentive to do that. You can now copy and paste these in. The next item that we're going to take a look at is the new smart list for deposits. And I know I can't do that, so I'm just going to post this transaction. And close my window, and I'll just cancel my reports. So the next thing that we are going to look at is smart lists that are going to show deposits that are on unposted sales transactions. So in sales, when you enter in a sales order, And I'm going to bring up a sales order that I've entered here. So I've got my sales order here entered in, same process as you normally would, but you may not be ready to post this transaction yet. However, if you've recorded a deposit for this, so in this case, I've entered in a $300 deposit on this, I do want to be able to see quickly what unposted sales transactions I do have that may have a deposit on them. So what I can do now is I can go into Smart Lists, and within Smart Lists, we're going to go under Sales and Sales Transactions. And right after our asterisk, which is always our default report, the next option that we have here is Deposits on Unposted Sales Transactions. So in this window, then we can see just quickly at a glance any deposits that we received on sales orders that have not been posted yet. And it just gives a good way to see what's out there at a quick glance. The next item that we're going to take a look at is start and end dates on pay codes. So this is a really great feature because it allows people to go in, and if they're going to be adding pay codes or changing pay codes on employees, they can define in advance those pay codes that need to come into play. So on the employee card itself, when you assign a pay code, you now have the ability to go in and identify those start and end dates. So if we look at just a particular bonus pay code, we could identify start and end dates for that pay code. That'll also allow us to report on those, and you can see what's been set up and what hasn't been set up. All right, the next topic that we're going to take a look at is some of the uncommonly used features within Dynamics GP. So one of the things that you can do in GP is actually trigger a notification in fixed assets when a purchase or payables transaction has been entered. And you can do that based on either an account or a receipt if you're doing a purchase order. I like to use this with accounts, and then I can trigger these off of payables transactions as well. So the first thing that we need to do is within the fixed asset setup, we want to go into the company option in setup, and we want to make sure that in the purchasing options, we have the post PM through to fixed assets and potentially the post POP or purchase order processing through fixed assets. And again, you can define by account or by receipt line for a purchase order. Your payables transactions are always going to be just based on those distributions. So once we have those marked, the next thing that we have to do is go in and identify the purchasing posting accounts that are going to be used as our trigger. So these are going to be typically your fixed asset accounts. So you would come in and you would bring up your account number. So I know that my furniture and fixed assets is 1500. And I want to assign that to my class ID for fixed assets that is also furniture and fixtures. Once I have that done, now when I go into purchasing and I enter a transaction in transaction entry, and I'm going to identify my vendor and my document number just as I normally would, my purchase amount, so how much I'm paying, and then when I go into distributions, now I have a default distribution account already set up for this vendor, but I'm going to change it to my fixed asset account. Oh, 500. Cancel. Let's get R. Since that's my balance sheet account, it will have a 000 in this case. So I'm going to click on OK, and I'm going to post my transaction. So what this is going to do is that when and I'll just cancel my reports here. So now when I go into fixed assets, and I'm going to go under cards and fixed assets and general. Now I have a purchases line above my class ID, and this is going to show me any transactions that have been entered in that are identified as those accounts. And so I can choose my transaction, and based on that, it's going to pull in some of my information. I still will need to do things like populate my asset ID and my description, but my class is already going to be assigned and my account group is going to be assigned. So it saves some time when you're doing that entry. Plus, it's a good way to send that communication through GP that there is or there are fixed assets that need to be entered into fixed assets versus just the payables transaction itself. And the next area that we're going to take a look at is using account categories with Management Reporter. So within Management Reporter, I'll just open this up here. So within Management Reporter, a lot of times users will set up their reports based on GL accounts rather than utilizing the account categories in the GL. So I will actually flip back here and just take a look at that. So on our cards and financial and account, we all know that we have the categories here of cash, and there are 48 out-of-the-box categories within GP. You can add to these categories if there's additional categories that you need to use, or you want to do additional breakouts of data, or a lot of times people will want to break things out maybe by department or division, that you want to see those. So based on these categories, we can then define our Management Reporter reports by the category. The benefit to doing that is that if you use your categories on your Management Reporter reports, every time you add a new account, maybe merge an account, you don't have to go in and update your Management Reporter reports. So I'm going to bring Management Reporter back up, and I'm just going to go into my default report definitions, and we'll take a look at the balance sheet. And really where this comes into play is the row definitions. You still have the ability to do trees and other functions within Management Reporter. All this does is make it easier so that when if you do a lot of changes to your GL accounts, that you can very easily have your MR reports updated. You don't have to come in here and assign any new accounts or shift things around. You can do that all based on just changing that account category in the GL. So you can see in this particular report, I have these set up based on my account category of cash. I use my short-term investments, accounts receivable, prepaid expenses, inventory, etc. So these are all based on my account categories. So if I go in and add any new accounts, I have to assign those categories anyway. By assigning that, then my categories, or rather my Management Reporter reports, will always be updated with the correct account information. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is the Reconcile to General Ledger. So the Reconcile to General Ledger is found under Routines, Financial, and Reconcile to GL. And this process is available now for payables, receivables, but also inventory and bank reconciliation. So we're going to use payables management as an example. And I'm going to change my dates here because I've entered a couple of transactions now in payables. And the one thing that you do have to do in this window is make sure that you define this output file. So this is where we're going to save this file. If it's not populated here, then you can go in and enter that in if you want to give it a different name. It is going to default into PM to GL in this case. If you were doing receivables, it would default in as RM to GL, and then it will hold the dates. You can run this over and over, and it will save each file individually. So it'll increment the number here so that if you're making changes or corrections and you want to come in and rerun the report, you'll have the old ones as well. So I'm going to click on Save there. The other thing that you want to do here is make sure that you have all of your accounts in place. So if for payables, you're reconciling to multiple payables accounts, possibly accrued purchases, you would want to add those accounts in here so that when you run this process, it's pulling that data for all of those accounts. Now you can also do it where you're just doing those individual accounts. So if you're trying to reconcile your accrued purchases, you could use just that account in there. Once you have everything set here, you're going to click on Process. And that is going to create the reconciliation. So what the reconciliation will do, and we'll just open this up here, is this is going to show us based on the date range that we've selected. And I'm going to just give us a little more space here. So it's going to show us on the left side our payables transactions. The right side is our general ledger transactions. And really what this is doing is helping us to find if there's differences when we're trying to reconcile our subledger to our general ledger. The first section here is going to be the unmatched transactions. So these are transactions that are posted in the GL, posted in payables, but not posted in the GL yet. So potentially, depending on your posting settings, if you've transaction level posted and you have not turned on the post through GL function in posting setup that we took a look at earlier, you do have transactions sitting in the GL that need to be posted. So that would explain some of these. The next section here is the potentially matched transactions, and that is showing you then these look like they're pretty close to matching, our dollar amounts match. It looks like they're okay, but it gives you that ability to go in and take a look at those if something is off. And then we do have our matched transactions down below. So you can go through this, and this will help you find any transactions that maybe haven't been posted yet. Or the other thing that can happen is if you haven't turned off the posting to the accounts, direct posting, and I will just minimize that so you can see where that is in our accounts. And I'm going to bring up our payables account. So this checkbox for allow account entry, what that means is when you have this checked on, users that have access can go into the GL and enter a transaction directly to your payables account. That is going to impact when you're trying to reconcile your subledger to your GL, because the transaction that you enter directly to the GL is not going to show up on your subledger reports. So you would be out of balance at that point. So just something that you want to keep in mind when you're reconciling subledgers is looking at how your accounts are set as far as allowing account entry. And the last topic that we're going to take a look at now is the all-in-one views. So the all-in-one views are a great way to just be able to go in and see information based on a vendor or transactions at a summary level. One of the ways that you can access the all-in-one views on vendors is to go into the vendor maintenance window, and we're going to bring up our vendor. Actually, we'll use this one. And at the top of the page, you've got the all-in-one view. So the all-in-one view is going to populate with the transactions 5 at a time for, in this case, this particular vendor. So you're going to be able to see things like invoices and purchase orders and receipts and other activity for this particular vendor. You have the ability to sort each individual column, whether it's ascending or descending. And the other thing that's been added now, which is very helpful, is the document numbers. So now you'll see those document numbers in this all-in-one view. And again, a great way to just go in and see transactions at a summary level for a particular vendor in this case. All right, those are the topics that I wanted to cover today. I thank you so much for attending. I appreciate DynamicsCon for voting me in so I could present these topics to you. And I hope you have a great afternoon. If you have any questions at all, please enter them in the chat, and I'm happy to talk with you further on any of these topics or any other SMB topics. Thank you.
Hey, thanks so much, Deb. GP is such a robust solution. It's great to get a refresh on those new features or frequently unused features in the system. So let's talk through some of the frequently asked questions we get here at Stoneridge. But before we get into that, I just want to reiterate what Deb said. We do want to answer all of your questions that you have live right here. So go ahead and type those questions into the chat and we'll get those answered for you. One of the first things that we often get asked here is, well, there are a lot of people who are experienced with GP. I know there are a lot of people who are new to the platform. Deb, do you have any advice to anyone who is new to GP and looking to learn as much as possible?
I do. Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you, DynamicsCon, for being able to present on Dynamics GP today. For people that are new to the platform, I would say, as with implementing any ERP solution, there are a lot of things to consider, and making sure, probably the biggest thing is that you get the right people involved in that process. And as you're going through that ERP implementation, to continue to follow processes and understanding where you want to end up with that ERP solution. That's definitely a big topic for companies to decide when they're going to implement. And for GP users, I would say that probably the biggest thing is make sure you get your users in the system. The Stoneridge process is going to go through what we call JPODs, and then CRP, which is a conference room pilot, and then UAT. And throughout that process, it's extremely important to get your users involved, get them in the system so that they're ready to go when it's time to go live.
Yeah, that's great advice, Deb. And, I think we talked to a lot of people as well that maybe they're not going through an implementation. Maybe they've just been using GP for a long time and need to look at those processes. Do you have any recommendations for people who may be using GP, but they're not really taking full advantage of the system?
Absolutely. So probably the biggest thing to do there is to reach out to, in this case, if you were reaching out to us, you'd reach out to Stoneridge and ask them for estimates on how we can best do an ERP, which is an enterprise process review or a business process review, based on either specific areas that you want to look at or all of your processes throughout your ERP solution, whether it's GP or any other solution.
Great. And I know that GP has moved to the modern life cycle policy. I bet there's a lot of people listening who know what that is, but there's probably some people listening who don't know what the implications of that are. So can you tell us a little bit more about what this modern life cycle policy means, where people can find information on that, and where they can learn more about new releases and new features and functionality?
Absolutely. So GP was originally on the fixed lifecycle policy, and through version GP 18.2, that is a fixed lifecycle policy. And so what that means is that it's not really a rolling policy, but a fixed policy where when we're done with that version, it's done. So 2013, 2015, 2016, and through 2018 R2, those are fixed life policies. The modern life cycle policy runs us around to at least one of 3 yearly planned releases. And in order to stay on that modern life cycle policy, then end users and clients just need to make sure that they take at least one of those so that they can stay current. There are a lot of new features and functionality available in GP, as I walked through some of those a little bit ago in the presentation, and GP is still a good process and a good ERP solution to work with.
Yeah, I completely agree 100%. So, with those updates that people are taking in the modern life cycle, does that include the year end or the tax updates, or are those still separate, or how does that work?
So, year-end updates for the fixed life cycle policy, that is typically released in November, and with the modern life cycle policy, that'll be included in that year-end release. We have traditionally had that release happen right around the Thanksgiving timeframe, and then need to consider and schedule to get your year-end update done, whether you're working with us or any other partner. You do want to make sure that you're looking at what needs to happen to get that year-end update installed Are you a customer that uses a lot of ISVs or complicated or complex ISVs? You'll want to consider those as well for your year-end updates. The biggest considerations are payroll and payables. And as we're now almost done with September, it's time to really start thinking about what's that process going to look like at year end.
Perfect.
And Sabrina, do you know, can I put a link in the chat for some of that documentation?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay. So I'll put the link in for the life cycle, and users can see or go to that to see more information on that life cycle policy, as well as I'm going to include the link to the new features and functionality for Dynamics GP. And then I'll give back to you.
Yeah, fantastic. Those are great resources. I just popped those in the chat here. I know, there's all these new features constantly coming out. What if a user has an idea for a feature that isn't currently in the solution? What can they do with those ideas that they have?
So there is actually an ideas site that users can go in and select their product, the one that they're using. So whether it's any Dynamics product, so whether you're using Dynamics 365 or BC or GP, you can select your product and then write in your recommendation. You can also see the lists out there that are currently out as recommendations. And as we get near to the close of a release cycle, then Microsoft will go through and look at those requests, and users, end users, clients, everyone can vote on those, and the top voted suggestions are generally what gets included in the release. Not always, but, and I'll put the link for that ideas site also in the chat so you can share that. And that's where users can go.
Yeah, I would definitely say get out there and vote and put in your ideas, because that's just how the software just keeps improving and getting better and better. I haven't seen any other questions come in the chat, so go ahead, type those in. I have one more question here to ask Deb, so get your questions in quick before we wrap this up. But Deb, do you have any sources that you go to when you have a question on functionality or features in the system? What's your spot that you go to learn more about GP?
So I really start with, similar to that, docs.microsoft.com, find the information for GP. Honestly, Google gets a lot of searches. It's it's just well used, and there's a lot of great information out there. For me personally, working with a feature that is new is the best way that I can learn it, and then from there, we do our best to keep blogs updated, and Sabrina's a great part of that on the Stoneridge website, and a lot of partners will do similar blog type information. So
we did have a question come in from Kevin about showing the purchasing feature and the last item. We can't show that live today, but I don't know, Deb, if you want to just talk to this purchasing feature at all.
Sure. So was it the purchasing feature, the last one? Is that what he said? So that was the vendor all-in-one card.
Yeah.
So that purchasing feature is really throughout not only vendors, but you can also look at that for customers. And the easiest way to access that is if you go into the vendor card and bring up your vendor, and then if you click on that all-in-one view, that's going to give you that summarized view of transactions for that particular vendor. You can sort on that window, and you can drill into those individual transactions to see what's there. You can do the same thing on the customer side as well.
Okay, great. Thanks for that question, Kevin, and thanks for the answer, Deb. I haven't seen any other questions come in, but if you think of questions, we always want to answer those for you. So you can reach out to Deb or myself here at Stoneridge. You can email us. Our email address is solutions@stoneridgesoftware.com, and happy to clarify anything that was presented today or answer any questions that you have about GP. We have a whole team here that is very passionate about GP, loves the system, and wants to make sure that it works for you. Anything else to add, Deb?
I don't. It's almost October. Start thinking about year end. Get yourself
Yep.
scheduled.
Perfect. Well, thank you. And thanks, DynamicsCon, for having us today.
Thank you, DynamicsCon.